Good morning, and welcome to Business Breathers, a webinar series hosted by the Goodman Group, which is a part of the Goodman School of Business at Brock University. We begin by acknowledging the land on which our university is located is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, where many continue to live and work today. The territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this land is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. Hi, I'm Andrew Gaudes. I'm the Dean of the Goodman School of Business here at Brock University. Business Breathers was launched as a brief reprieve from our shut-in life created by COVID, offering a discussion and insight on the areas of leadership, management, innovation, and the impact of trending topics. Our Goodman Group hosts these webinars every other Wednesday and features members of our Brock community and leading experts to speak on these topics. The webinar is an interactive discussion which allows time for your questions, so I invite all of you watching today to enter your questions in the chat feature, and we will present them as time allows. As we all have been working through this prolonged disruption, which here in Ontario is about to become more restrictive, we have come to see the extraordinary efforts of people in our community who have ensured our food supply and the supply chain in general, as well as medical and personal care services, are sustained. Everyday people in our neighborhood, among our friends and family, have been thrust into extraordinary circumstances. In light of their ongoing contributions, it's a privilege to recognize their effort with our topic of today's Business Breather, Extraordinary Canadians, and have as our guest none other than lead author of the book Extraordinary Canadians, Stories from the Heart of Our Nation, Peter Mansbridge. This is a book which celebrates people who have overcome adversity and who champion the rights and freedoms shared by everyone who calls Canada home. Peter is known for his 5 decades of work at CBC, where he was chief correspondent of CBC News and anchor of the National for 30 years, guiding us through the political, economic, and cultural events which have shaped our country. He has won dozens of awards for outstanding journalism, has 13 honorary doctorates from universities in Canada and the United States, and received Canada's highest civilian honor, the Order of Canada, in 2008. Peter is the former 2-term Chancellor of Mount Allison University, a distinguished fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and is currently the president of Manscorp Media Services, where his work includes documentary film production. Peter is also the host of The Bridge, a weekly podcast which has become daily at the outset of the pandemic, exploring various trends in politics and journalism. Peter, welcome to Business Breathers. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Andrew. Thanks so much for the invite, and hello to all those who may be tuning in from different parts of the country today.
Well, thank you. I hope you don't mind. I want to start by sharing with you and our viewers an event from a number of years ago, which we were both at, actually. It took place in New Brunswick at the Fredericton campus of the University of New Brunswick, where at that time I was an entrepreneur professor. There was a reception hosted by our Entrepreneurship Center, which had a long list of dignitaries representing various levels of government, business, and the university. People were milling about, and naturally, you were having like polite conversation with them. But I had taken note and remember to this day how you paused to spend a good portion of time with an elderly gentleman who was there, what seemed by chance, and you were intently listening to him as though nobody else was in the room. I suspect the scenario played out repeatedly through your career, where you had an interest to speak to people on the side stage rather than ones on the spotlight. And of course, one would think that this is because you're a journalist and you're always interested in a good story. But I wonder if you could start off by sharing with us, particularly the students and those starting off in their careers who are watching, why your attention and time would be drawn to individuals such as I observed, rather than the others present, who many starting off in their careers would arguably see as people they would aspire to become.
It's an interesting question, and let me tell you that throughout my career, I've been lucky enough to have met all kinds of people, a lot of famous people, presidents and prime ministers and members of the royal family, the different religious leaders, actors, sports figures, the whole bit. And I feel better for having met them and learned from them in different ways. But quite frankly, the people I've learned from the most and who have struck me the most are those who aren't the celebrities, aren't the famous people. They're just ordinary people who, for the lack of a better term, have led extraordinary lives. Now, I don't remember that particular case in New Brunswick, but if it was an elderly gentleman, it may have been a veteran of some kind, and he may have been, telling me stories about his service in the Canadian military. But those kind of moments have always meant more to me overall than the others, as important as the others were. I mean, there's nothing like sitting across from the President of the United States and in the White House and interviewing them. But in a way, it's kind of predictable what's going to happen in those interviews. The other circumstances are unpredictable, and the stories are unvarnished. There's no spin. It's just basically kind of what happened to them in particular circumstances. And that was actually the way I went after the book. My co-author, Mark Bulgich, and I had decided early on that we were going to profile what we called extraordinary Canadians, but in most cases, we wanted to ensure that these people weren't generally known. Some of them are in the book, but most of them aren't. But their stories are extraordinary, and we can learn from each one of them.
Now, and it's interesting because that was where I was going to go next with my question, was about the book and how you drew on that experience with looking at individual Canadians who are not necessarily extraordinary by their the media presence, but extraordinary in how they respond to extraordinary circumstances. So how did you narrow it down, given the thousands of people that you would have met and have conversations over all of these decades? How did you come down to the 16 that are in the book?
Well, we wanted to ensure that certain things were followed. We wanted all parts of the country to be represented. We wanted both genders represented. We wanted to ensure various cultures, various professions were all represented within the book. So that helped narrow it down. But then we looked for particular stories, and stories that were different and yet at the same time all represented various challenges in these people's lives and how they responded to those challenges. So, first of all, it's not hard to find extraordinary Canadians. We're a country of 35 million people. There should be more than 16 or 17 of them out there.
Sure.
So we ended up with, a good list, but we narrowed it down to those who were in the book.
Okay. Now, given the stories that are portrayed by the individuals, I suspect that many of them were not particularly keen on sharing their own personal life as much as they're interested in being advocates for the causes of the people that they represent or speak for. So it must have taken a little bit of convincing, cajoling in order for them to say, okay, I'll allow you to put my personal life into your book.
You're right, quite correct on that. In fact, none of those who we contacted were looking for publicity. We didn't get calls saying, hey, I'm an extraordinary person, I want to be in your book. It was quite the opposite. Usually, especially when I'd phone one of them, they'd say, yeah, sure, you're Peter Mansbridge, why are you calling me? And I would say, listen, I know a little bit about your life, and I find it fascinating. I want to know a little more because we're thinking of doing this book. And then they would go, no. There's nothing extraordinary about me. I'm just a gal. I'm just a guy. I do my thing. And I said, well, let's talk about that. And so the more we talked, the more convinced I would become in certain cases. And then it became a matter of convincing them to really open up. And in all the cases that we featured, they were all agreeable to opening up and telling their story because they saw it as a way of encouraging and inspiring others who may be in similar situations. As I said, all of these, there's actually 17 of them, and they all
Okay.
have different challenges within their lives. It could be a sickness, it could be an accident, it could be racism, it could be any number of different things. And the way they responded to their situations are an inspiration for others, and especially so this year. I mean, listen, we and the publisher, Simon & Schuster, never expected this was going to be a #1 bestseller. It was in the first week it was out, and then it remained so for almost right through until Christmas. And I think it was partly because we got lucky on, if you wish, on the timing. The pandemic has resulted in a lot of Canadians looking for inspiration from others who've met big challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And that's every page of this book.
Yeah. And so you had them agree to share their personal journeys in the book. How long ago was it that you started the conversations with Mark about creating this book? And how long did it take for them to be encouraged into participating? And I know probably a substantial part of this was probably written during the disruption that we've been experiencing, but the catalyst for this must have happened in advance of our disruption, which will be coming up to a year in March.
Yeah, you're right about that. The genesis of the book was actually Simon & Schuster. They came to me and said, we'd like to do a kind of everyday heroes book, homegrown heroes, that kind of book. And we think you're the perfect person to do it. And I said, well, let me think about that for a while. I said, I'm really busy right now. This was the spring of 2019. I was, in fact, overseas for most of that year on my documentary shoots. And I said, so I've got a problem on timing. I like the idea, but can we put a little meat on the bone, so to speak, in terms of how that idea could move forward? And so we moved it to this concept of extraordinary Canadians and for the most part, Canadians who weren't generally known already. And started working at it. And that's when I brought Mark on board, because I knew my time was going to be limited, so I was going to have to divide some of this up. And Mark and I had worked together for 30 years. So he worked at the CBC with me. And so the relationship was perfect for this. And so we started full on in the summer of 2019. And the first target date for a draft was March of 2020. So in other words, right when we were understanding the full force of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so both Mark and I were concerned that, we don't have anybody in here that's got anything to do with the pandemic, and we probably should have. And so that's why we ended up choosing this nurse from Vancouver, Moses Lee,
right,
who had a great story. And we kind of did his story in March and April of 2020, and it was the last one to be done. So you're right. We were writing this not during the pandemic, but in a strange way, it kind of worked perfectly for a lot of readers because we were in a pandemic, and they were looking for inspiration.
Yeah, and I see Moses is the fourth individual in the book presented. And it is a wide variety of individuals, backgrounds, cultures, origins, geography. It really is quite varied. And to that point, and you brought in the fact that Simon Schuster were the genesis of this, but also Sarah St. Pierre advised you that do this in the first person. Yeah. Which, standing out saying, well, okay, well, that's not too complicated to write it, like as if you are the person. But to do that for 16 individuals of 16 so wildly diverse backgrounds and perspectives, and then to read the book, one chapter after the other. And I think it's really, when you read several one after the other, you really get this, that the tone, the character, the inflection, the language used changes from one to the next, as if it is written by the individual. And I kept on thinking in my mind, the analogy is, it's like a soundstage with a microphone. And they walked in one at a time, picked up the microphone and started talking about their lives. And then when you stand outside, you go, but hold it, they didn't write this. This was Peter and Mark, and with the oversight of the editor, Sarah. So that's a fantastically tremendous effort to be able to do that in a believable way, that you really believe the individual who the story is about, personal. It's a personal life. It's not just a specific experience, is written by someone else. So I can only imagine the interaction back and forth with each individual, because it's personal. It's wildly personal. And you must have heard a few times, that's not me. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't think like that. Or that's not how kind I would have been in that circumstance. I would be quite outraged. So I wonder if you could shed some light on that.
Well, it was a strange process because neither Mark and I had thought of this idea of writing it in their voice. And it was Sarah St. Pierre, who's kind of the main editor at Simon & Schuster, and terrific to work with. She really knows how to crack the whip. She convinced us that this would be a good way to go. And I was concerned initially, having never written that way. I mean, I spent my career telling stories about other people, but in my voice, not in their voice. And but the process actually turned out to be quite enjoyable and not as hard as I thought it would be. Each person we talked to at length, either in person or on the phone. Most of them were done on the phone because of distances and schedules and everything. But at length, 3 or 4 or 5 times. And we record the interviews and transcribe them, and then look at them and say, well, I can see how this story could flow. We'll move this to here and not to there, but keeping it in their voice. And that's basically the way we wrote it. I mean, I write a particular way. Mark writes in a particular way. We look for different things. I look for moments in a person's life that may end up saying something about the path they end up taking. The first story in the book is about Cindy Blackstock, who some of our viewers may have heard of before. She's an activist on Indigenous affairs, especially as they relate to children, based in Ottawa. And she's a terrific person who I interviewed in my career earlier, and kind of stuck in the back of my mind that this is somebody really special. And so I wanted to hear her story. So I called her up and we talked on the phone, and I could tell very quickly that this was a great story. I mean, without going into all the detail, I mean, she grew up in BC, in the interior of BC. Her mother was non-Indigenous. Her father was Indigenous. And she found out at a very early age, 3 or 4 years old, that if she was out with just one of her parents, she was treated very differently depending on which one she was with. And that has become the path of her life, is trying to make those situations similar, not different, especially when it gets into the hardcore stuff of education and healthcare. And so for me, that was the way into Cindy's story. You taking that moment and drawing the path that's led her to where she is now as one of the most ardent activists and successful activists on a really important issue that confronts still to this day our country.
I'd see this as demanding a high level of empathy. And really, quite frankly, I would see it as also emotionally exhausting as you place yourself into each individual in the moments that they've experienced. And so given that, it must have also been a period of discovery for yourself and for Mark, as you really walk the shoes of someone else for a mile and put yourselves into their lives. Did this, through this experience, did it actually have moments where it changed how you saw people or saw your perspective on certain groups in any way? Because you would have been exposing or looking at something through the lens of someone else's eyes for a period of time in order to be able to write in the first person like that.
Here's the way I look at the lessons from me from the stories in this book. They're all extraordinary people, and the things they've done are special, and the way they've reacted to the challenges in their lives are quite inspiring. So that's one way of looking at their stories. There's another way too, which is, we're proud of our country. We all are, and we all, love to hear how other countries wish they were Canada, and they do, and you see it when you travel the world.
Mm-hmm.
But what these stories also speak to is that, we're not done yet in making this place, that we have issues, and we still have to address them. So while this book is inspiring and rewarding to read, it's also kind of a warning that there are still things we need to address about ourselves and about our country, and we need to do that to truly live up to the way, in many cases, others think of us and we think of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And in that light, do you see that the experience that you had, the exercise that you went through in speaking with these Canadians and creating a story in their first person, is there something that you can share as advice or suggestions to students, new graduates, career building, at the outset of their careers, as to how they can build a greater sense of empathy or appreciation for the diverse cultures and across our country?
Well, I think they've got to be realistic about where we live and the situations that exist in our country. And I think they have to go out of their way to learn more about
Mm-hmm.
the various situations that exist in Canada that create the successes and the divisions that are still with us. I started my career in northern Manitoba, in Churchill,
Mm-hmm.
in 1968. I was 19 years old. I'd had a very privileged life. I was born in England, raised in Southeast Asia, went to school in Ottawa. And when I landed in Churchill, as I hate to admit it, but I was a high school dropout. I hadn't been to university. I landed in Churchill, and I didn't really recognize what was going on right around me in terms of the racism that existed for Indigenous peoples. And, it took me a year or two to fully appreciate what was happening and to understand that something had to change. So when I started in journalism, kind of a year or 2 years into my stay in northern Manitoba, one of the issues that I was constantly confronted with were the problems that existed between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And so obviously as a journalist, you ask a lot of questions. You ask it of, provincial and federal authorities. And when you get the opportunity to interview cabinet ministers, you challenge them on the situation that exists. So that's 68, 69, 70. When I stepped down from the National, almost 50 years, half a century later, what I found disturbing is that the questions, many of them are still exactly the same as they were back then. There have been improvements, and you can't take away from that. But there's still real difficulties in that relationship, and we can't ignore it. And for me, I'll walk off the stage at some point in the next who knows how many years, and future generations, like those who are watching this in the student group, it's their turn, from both sides of this issue, because there's no, and both sides have problems in the relationship and the way they've conducted themselves. But it's future generations who now they've got to find a way to resolve it. So 50 years from now, they're not saying, well, it's the same old questions. We can't, we've got to do something about that. And to do something about that, you've got to invest yourself in your country, in its issues, in public service, in any number of different ways, beyond the comfortable pew that you may want to end up taking.
Sure. And, this is a good time actually to bring in a question from one of our viewers who's asking this. Do you have any tips for aspiring journalists, especially during a time when the demand for the profession seems to be on the decline?
Yeah, here's the way I'd answer that. There are real issues about journalism right now and the landscape in journalism, and serious issues about trust and truth uh, and and just how things are done. But the need for journalism, I don't think has ever been greater. So it's both sides of the question that's being asked there. If you want to be a journalist, you got to start off from the assumption, and this is my belief, that there are three kind of core things you can't be trained or educated for. You got to have them. You got to be fascinated by what's going on around you, interested in what's going on around you. That's one. Two, you got to be able to ask questions of those who might have the answers about what's going on. And thirdly, you have to have the ability to communicate what you learn to others who are equally interested. So that's the core. And you kind of got to have that to start with. And then you start layering on education and an experience and a willingness to move around the country or the world to understand the answers that you're getting. That's kind of the core principles in terms of advice. What I always say, I mean, as somebody who achieved the heights of journalism in television, as chief correspondent of the CBC, I started in Churchill, Manitoba, a community of 1,000 people, at a little radio station that was, not much bigger than the room I'm sitting in today, where I do my little podcast from each day. So to achieve that kind of success, to me, was helped by the fact I started in a small town. I covered everything from, the local council to school boards to whatever. And I found that those areas are more important in most people's lives. The decisions that are made at the school board level, at the town council level, are more important than anything you'll see in Ottawa or Washington. Those are things that really deeply affect people, how their communities operate, how safe is the water, how good are the roads, or how good are the schools. All of those things matter deeply. And so to understand the big issues, you've got to start by understanding and appreciating the smaller ones. So I always tell people, don't become just another person who's sitting in Toronto waiting for a Toronto job. Out there, there's little stations and newspapers and internet operations all over the country. So get out there and look around.
Now, you started with humble beginnings, as you mentioned, in Churchill, in journalism, but you didn't go to Churchill for journalism. If I got the story right, you were discovered in Churchill and doing something else, and someone kind of pulled you over to the station. I wonder if you could share that with the viewers.
Well, as I said, it's not like I had the credentials for any big job. So when I landed in Churchill, Manitoba, I was loading airplanes. I was loading freight and occasionally, selling tickets to passengers. And one day, the flight out of Churchill to Winnipeg, we'd oversold it, which we used to do all the time because a lot of people didn't turn up. But they did turn up on that day. So there was a bit of chaos at the front desk. And I'd been loading bags, and they asked me, will you call the flight over the PA system, or a microphone, like this one. And so I went over to the microphone. I said, Transair Flight 106 for Thompson-the-Paw in Winnipeg, now ready for boarding at Gate 1. We only had one gate, but it sounded very professional. And there was a guy, everybody went streaming over to the door to get on the plane, and one guy came the other way, and he said, hey, you've got a good voice. Have you ever thought about being in radio? And I said, no, like I've never thought about broadcasting. And he said, well, I'm the manager of the CBC Northern Service Station here in Churchill. and I can't get anybody to work the late night shift. Nobody. He couldn't find anybody who would do this job. And he said, would you be interested? And I said, sure. And so I started the next night. I worked during the day at Transair, and I did the late night kind of record music show on CHFC Fort Churchill, which tells you a lot. First of all, a job like that today, there'd be 200 people who'd apply for it, right? From all kinds of places, journalism schools, various universities across the country. But they didn't then. Nobody did. And that was partly, it was a different era. It was the 60s. It was before Watergate, when suddenly journalism, there was this explosion in journalism. Everybody wanted to be, you know, Robert Redford from Watergate days. But that tells you one thing. The other thing it tells you is there was no effective HR department in the CBC in those days. Nobody asked me anything. They didn't ask about my education. They didn't ask about where I'd been in my life. All they knew about me was that they thought I had a voice that worked on radio. That was it.
Well, this is a good segue for another question here. At that point, you know, you go through the nearly 50 years of journalism. This may be a bit difficult one. Maybe it's easy. I'm not sure, but I'm certainly going to ask it. If you were not a journalist, what would your occupation choice be? I mean, back then, and maybe halfway through, and maybe today.
Well, I'd probably still be loading bags at the Churchill Airport. Who knows? You know, when I was growing up, you know, if I'd applied myself a lot harder, I wanted to either be a lawyer or an underwater archaeologist. Those were the two things that kind of were in my mind. But I didn't, you know, I was late. I was really lazy at school. There was kind of a 60s thing, not to make an excuse. I was just lazy. There were other things I wanted to do, and I wanted to travel, and I wanted to do this, that, and the other thing. So I didn't get out of high school, and therefore university was never an option, which always makes it funny when I hear people like you read my biog and say, you know, he's got 13 honorary degrees, and he was chancellor of the university. And I'm thinking, geez, I wonder if I could trade any of that for a real degree. But anyway, so those were the things I kind of thought about. But I never felt pressured, even when I was doing the baggage handling thing and selling tickets. I was very young, and you kind of think, well, things are going to kind of work out somehow at some point. And then I got unbelievably lucky, but luck does cross paths with you in your life at any number of different times. And it's what you do with that opportunity. I'd had opportunities before then and hadn't handled them well, including going to school. But this one kind of came along at a time when I thought, you know, this, especially after I'd done a couple of nights at the radio station, I thought, I love doing this. And I will be crazy if I don't take advantage of this and make something of it. And so that's what happened. And, you know, and I did, and I worked really hard. I had the disadvantage of being up against a lot of other people on every step in the path that I took, who had different qualifications, much more impressive qualifications than I had, which meant I had to work that much harder to get ahead. And I worked hours and hours and hours on my own time to do that.
Now let's take a mental fast forward over these nearly 50 years. All the questions that you've asked people, all the people you've talked to. Another question from the viewers. What is one question that you wish you had asked to who, asked and to whom?
I can remember.
Not easy. But.
I remember interviewing Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, after she came out of office. I'd interviewed her a couple of times when she was Prime Minister, but I was interviewing her after, and she was going around the world selling a book, like they all do, called Downing Street Years. And I'd read the book. It wasn't that good a book. But I'd been fascinated by her career, and especially during her leadership during the Falklands War, the conflict with Argentina in 1982. And I wanted to ask her some questions about that. So we get into this interview, and it was just brutal because she kept accusing me of not having read the book. And I kept saying, no, I read the book. I just want to get at this particular. And she wasn't cooperative at all. And there was a point at which, on the third or fourth time, she said, "You never read this book. I know you never read this book." And it flashed through my mind a question that I chose not to ask, and I've regretted it ever since. And this was 25 years ago. I should have said, when she said, "You never read this book," I should have said, "Did you write it?" Because she didn't. She had a couple of ghostwriters write the thing, and I knew that. And it wasn't kind of generally known. It was known by some, but I didn't. And it would have totally changed the dynamic of the interview, which went even further downhill at that point because I'd passed up that opportunity. And the funny thing was, at the end of the interview, I was sitting there with her book, like this, sitting beside me on a little table, that you usually see that in those kind of book interviews. And we finished the interview, but it hadn't gone well. Their cameras people are turning the lights off and starting to, dismantle their equipment. And she looks over at me, and for the first time in whatever it was, 20, 25 minutes we've been sitting there, she smiled and she said, "Peter, would you like me to sign your book?" As if we were the greatest of friends, right? And I know what I should have told her to do with her book, but I didn't, and instead I got her to sign it. And it still sits here in my library. I don't think I've opened it since the day she gave it to me.
But, that goes to a point of your character, Peter, as an individual, as a journalist, as a representative of what's happening in the world, which is rare today, where you might have an opinion, you might have a perspective, but it's not necessarily put there on a platform to be presented to the viewers. It's an objective perspective that you share, which seems to be a rare commodity now when we look across the media that we're receiving from around the world from so many different sources. And so, to that point, do you think that there's a responsibility here with the mainstream media on how the news is presented without the slant to one side or the other, that the opinion, the personal perspectives are kept internal so that the facts are presented and let the viewer receive it? I asked that as a question, but I'll also just add, when you were in New Brunswick, I remember you saying that as a chief editor of the National, it was your decision as to what led in the evening as the news. And the question you asked is what the Canadians need to know to be better informed today to make decisions tomorrow.
Yeah, it wasn't my decision solely, but I was part of your editorial group that would make that decision every day. And there will always be good arguments about what should lead, which was, as I've told many journalists, if you're in a newsroom where there's not a good debate or argument surrounding that question each day, then you're probably not in a good place. You want that kind of debate, and you're going to win some, you're going to lose some, and that's all part of it. But I still believe, the explosion in the way television news is done has created real issues surrounding that core principle that you talk about. I mean, news is news, and I shouldn't be, as a newscaster, shouldn't be trying to tell you what to think. I should be giving you the tools to think for yourself about how you want to feel about a subject. Now, since I've left and I do a podcast, I'm a little more free to talk about some of the things I believe. But in sitting in the anchor chair of a major network newscast is not the place to be giving opinion. Now, some shows are news and some shows are opinion. I mean, people get all upset about Fox News. in the evening because they have these people ranting away about their positions, all from the right. But those shows aren't newscasts. Those are opinion shows. They're almost entertainment, really, for some of them. And they do what they do. The actual news division of Fox is pretty good. I've got some friends who work there, just as I do at NBC and CBS and ABC, CNN, MSNBC. But sometimes it's not clear to the audience. In fact, most times it's not clear whether they're looking at news or are they looking at opinion. And it should be clear. It should be obvious. And the Trump era has made that division between what's news and what's opinion that much harder to see, especially in the last year, where a lot of journalists have thrown off the cloak of neutrality and just said, to hell with it, this guy's got to go. He's a liar and a cheat, and on and on and on. And so that has created some of the tension that exists between the people and those who report the news. And we're in a very difficult place here in terms of trust, which is based on truth, and truth has become this commodity that that people are quite confused about these days. Sort of what is truth? Is it your truth, or is it my truth, or whose truth is it? And when you get into that, you got real problems. So the news business has got to look at itself very carefully right now and trying to restore a relationship that has been in trouble, and not just in the U.S.
And I'm going to reel it back into today and the topic of the discussion on extraordinary Canadians and COVID and all of this is going on. And you mentioned that you're able to speak a little more freely with your podcast, and I'd like to talk about that just for a moment. And we've only got a few minutes left. You have the podcast, which was a weekly podcast called The Bridge, and of course it's gone daily since the pandemic outset. So when you are presenting in the podcast, the stories are a little more varied. It's not just about COVID events and circumstances that we find ourselves in. You bring in, as yesterday was all about hockey in your podcast. Because hockey is starting today. But I wonder, is the outset of the daily was because of COVID. Is there a reason why you started that? And then the next one is, will you continue that when we're across this, I'll use the term, the bridge, on the other side?
I started it because very much as a hobby, the whole idea of a podcast. The CBC wanted me to do one for them. I decided, if I'm going to do a podcast, I don't want all the CBC bureaucracy sort of looking over my shoulder about what I'm doing and how I'm doing it and what I'm saying. I just want to do something. So I started it thinking, who's going to listen? Why would they be interested? But it turned out, when I got into daily, it's become like a very popular podcast. I mean, podcasting is odd. The numbers it's hard to read too much into this, but there's been more than 1.5 million downloads of the podcast since I went daily in March. And that's a lot for this business. And as a result, I've had a number of companies come after me who want to buy it, the distribution. And I'm probably, because everything, the cost of everything so far I've handled. And I've done everything myself. I do the whole thing. I do the production, and my son helps on occasion. But I'm probably going to sell it within the next week or two. And it will become, well, first of all, it'll stay for at least another year. Because I think we're into this for another year anyway, one way or the other. Hopefully it gets better during that year. And the other stories are going to be interesting to watch. How does Biden turn the U.S. back into the U.S. that we used to know? What happens in our own country? Because there's almost certainly going to be an election here. So there's lots to talk about, and I enjoy doing it, and it's fun. And as I said, and you asked about, I do get a little more freedom in what I can say and what I can do. I try to, keep that cloak of neutrality as best I can. Certainly on most topics, I've lost it a bit on the Trump stuff because it's just been so outrageous. But beyond that, I have some great discussions and look forward to doing it. Even the hockey one was great fun.
This might be answered with one word, yes or no. And I do want to close with this, but it's a question from our viewers. It says, would you ever consider writing another book about the heroes during the pandemic, another edition of Extraordinary Canadians, Pandemic Edition?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of those in the works already by other authors, and they're absolutely appropriate to be writing about because there are so many heroes. I mean, we tend to think of, and quite rightly, the frontline healthcare workers, but there are so many others, from firefighters and police officers and paramedics, farmers, grocery store clerks, postal workers. I mean, you go down the list of those who have become, in our view, essential workers, who a year ago we never thought of as essential. I mean, many times would you go into a grocery store and look at the guy or the gal who was, bagging apples or whatever and thinking they're essential to my life.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't think that, but you do now. And you have a whole totally different respect for them and for the farmers you drive by and you're out in the country and, all of that. So a book on those who helped get us through this really difficult time is certainly worthwhile. I am working on another book. I've been convinced by Simon & Schuster to write a different book, which I can't tell you about yet, but it will be out later this year.
We look forward to that. And thank you so much, Peter, for being part of our conversation today. And quite frankly, thanks for being such a significant contributor to how we define ourselves as Canadians. It's been a real pleasure to be able to speak to you today.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all the questions that people sent in as well.
Thank you. And thank you to all our viewers today for taking a breather with us. I also want to thank Abdul Rahimi, our director of Goodman Group, Cassie Price, our manager of Goodman Group Projects, and also Jillian Levick, our senior publicist at Simon & Schuster, for helping us with coordination with Peter. Our next webinar takes place on Wednesday, January 27th, on the topic of university management in the time of COVID, with our own Dr. Lynn Wells, Provost and Vice President of Brock University. We hope you can join us then. The Goodman Group of Services offer consulting, executive, professional, and venture development for Niagara and the broader community, provides direct access to Goodman School of Business faculty, staff, and students for a full range of learning and development opportunities. Our upcoming Goodman Group program is a 2-day seminar on cybersecurity, which will run January 26th and 27th from 1 to 4 p.m. And this program was developed in partnership with Supply Chain Canada's Ontario Institute. And there's still a few seats remaining for this online program. Thanks for watching. Stay safe. Focus on that within your life, which you can control. Direct your thoughts to your home, your family, and work. In sum, apply your skills and experience where you can make the best contribution. And don't forget the importance of wearing masks, maintaining physical distance, and good hygiene, and stay home. Thank you. Bye.